We are excited to have everybody coming in to join us for Moving from Surviving to Thriving with Dr. Meag-gan today. This is being led with the CMEP, the Community Mental Health Equity Project. Just some brief points before we shift over to Meag-gan today. This training is offered through CMEP project in the TA Center, which is funded by DHCS and administered by CARS. But the views, opinions, and content expressed in the presentation today do not necessarily reflect the views, opinions, or policies of DHCS. Just a brief bit about the team that makes up CMEP. It is under the umbrella of CARS with some of our partners, which you can see here. Today, our partner is going to be Dr. Meag-gan with Beam. So we are very excited. She has presented with us a few times in the past, and we are excited to have her back today. So I will go ahead and shift over to Dr. Meag-gan.
But yes, I'm marking the chat, but light up with who's in the room. Happy to be back. I'll go ahead and share my screen, introduce myself a little bit further, and we will get started. For those of you who don't know me, I'm a psychologist. I am a consultant. I have founded my own organization, but today I'm coming to you with BEAM, Black Emotional Mental Health Collective, a fantastic organization that I'm so honored to be a part of, that's doing a lot of healing justice work across the nation, really, and beginning to do so internationally. So I'll talk just a little bit more about BEAM, and then we'll dive into our topic for today. So BEAM is a national training movement, building, and grant-making institution that is dedicated to the healing, wellness, and liberation, right? So first we heal, we get well, and then we are liberated of Black and marginalized communities. So whether you identify as Black or marginalized or an ally to this community, this training and BEAM's efforts and mission includes you. So for myself, I link and align with BEAM because I too center Black and marginalized communities, and I'm all about reclaiming our worth and our wellness. So today, I get to bring to you my musings, my learnings on what does it mean to move from surviving to thriving. So as a cognitive behavioral therapist by training, as a liberation psychologist, I often like to start with definitions. What are the meaning of the words that we're using? So we're going to talk about surviving. We're going to talk about what is thriving. Then we're going to talk about how to move down or up the spectrum. And there'll be plenty of time to engage with one another. However, I want to start with some intentions. I like to start my day off with intentions, and I also like to start my trainings. So if you've been with me before, these may look familiar. I do ask or hope that you listen with your full self. What do I mean by that? Not just your above the chin cerebral intellectual self. I'm hoping you listen with all your other knowers, your heart, your gut, your intuition, right? Those are very awesome ways that we know things that often get overlooked. I hope that something in here challenges you today, not challenge in terms of upsets or offends, but challenges in terms of maybe inspires or ignites a new way of thinking or a new way of looking at something. We know that we grow at the growth edges of our life. I hope that you may be inspired and that you translate something that you learned here to better care for yourself, your loved ones, and definitely the clients that you serve. The last thing I'll say in full transparency today is that we do have a guest visitor. I have a young 3-month-old in my lap. Due to some family challenges this morning, my partner is away. And so we are doing this webinar together. So you might see a tiny hand reach up from here and there or a squeal. And I ask that we just roll on together. Appreciate your grace, everyone. So let's dive in with that first definition, that first word in our title, moving from surviving to thriving. So when we think of the survivor identity, our culture, and I'm thinking Western culture here, is kind of enamored with the idea of the survivor, right? We've had who knows how many seasons of the Survivor television show where people from all over get put in harsh conditions or reality show type conditions, and they see who's the last one standing. We, of course, remember Destiny's Child's song, I'm a Survivor, right? So what do we mean when we're saying survivor, right? We've overcome something or outlasted other people, right? But for our intents and purposes today, the survivor identity, when we bring it into a mental health context, is a little different and a little bit more profound, right? It has a particular meaning. So, survivors in our context that we're holding today are people who have experienced and overcame, endured some type of personal, collective hardship, right? Usually a trauma, right? Or a system of oppression. So we can be a survivor, past tense, or we're still surviving, ing, as in present tense, it's ongoing, right? And when we've overcome something, the survivor identity can be synonymous with almost how we identify ourselves, right? Think of cancer survivors. That's in a way they can identify to their community and to themselves. Think of trauma survivors, right? Survivors of intimate partner violence, survivors of natural disasters, right? So, and then there's also, larger backdrop systems, right? Um, Poverty, refugees, capitalism. We're all surviving that right now. And so we could really wrap our arms around a lot of different types of survivors, right? And so I want to talk a little bit more about the pros and cons of being a part of the survivor community and even being a survivor, being a part of your identity, right? So I think a core part of healing from any of those things we listed on the other slide is community care. We hear a lot about self care, but Beam and myself are really big on community care. Replenishment and recovery is not something we do on our own, right? No one among us is self made. We're all community made, right? From the earliest days on up, right? There's always someone that has poured into us or taken care of us at a time that we couldn't take care of ourselves as well. So, a big part of being a survivor is the survivor community. It provides support, understanding of what happened to you and how to recover, celebration of milestones. I'm thinking about the AA community and other substance communities where each year you get a coin, and each milestone there's a community that wraps its arms around you to celebrate you. There's also community support around mourning, having ongoing discussions about how to stay, in that case, sober, or how to stay coping with the trauma of managing the trauma of whatever you've survived, right? And then fellowship, right? Having that identity outside of that thing you've endured, right? That trauma or that survivor identity doesn't define you, but it is a part of your story, right? So, how do we find purpose, meaning, and a larger identity outside of that trauma? Okay. And since we're using the T word a lot, we're using the word trauma, it might be helpful to talk about that a little bit as well. So, there's a lot of definitions of trauma out there. But what I usually say to my clients, especially when they're thinking that their trauma doesn't fit as a trauma, I like to say trauma is any experience, directly experienced or vicariously experienced, where it was jarring, distressing, life threatening, that impaired you physically, emotionally, or spiritually, right? And so there's a lot of things that fit for trauma. Anything from a natural disaster, a sexual assault, bullying, anything that you deem was disparaging to your being, not affirming to you, that is having lasting impact, right? Sometimes we'll have clients that might play the trauma Olympics. Mine's not that bad. This thing didn't happen to me. And it doesn't matter what litmus test trauma needs to meet, is it impacting you and disparaging your functioning to this day? Then that could fit as a trauma. I like to embrace a very wide net, and then we get to help a very large community. Okay. So that's what a survivor is. That's what the community can look like, some elements of it. And so now I want us to kind of reflect for a moment, and we can all share in this reflection anonymously together by using this link. So our question is, what types of hardships have your clients survived? There's a lot of different organizations and types of service in the room today, in the Zoom room. So take a minute, think about the stories that you hold and witness and the people you journey with. What types of traumas have they endured? Go ahead and drop in the link there. What type of survivors are you dealing with? And we'll be able to see in real time some of your responses in the room. And you can share more than one. Mhm. Okay, got a couple coming in. Domestic violence, child abuse, disabilities, fire and loss of a home. Of course, that's a trauma, right? Of course, domestic violence. Child abuse as well. That these are some of the ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. I always like to ask about those because they can really impact the trajectory of a person's life. Unfortunately, rape, parental abuse, toxic work environment. Thank you for adding that as well. That is something a lot of people are surviving currently today, with layoffs, with chronic burnout being something that a lot of us are experiencing. And oftentimes, toxic work environment is almost becoming unseen as a type of something you're enduring. People are just expecting their workplace to be uninhabitable. So I'm really happy this one of our colleagues in the room has labeled that as something that we're surviving. Adverse childhood experiences, homelessness, chronic or multiple abuses, loss of a loved one, war, job loss. Mhm. Yeah. Uh, Now, here we have an interesting share here. We have just being African American, being in the part of the LGBT community. Let's talk about this. Thank you for this share. So this demographic identity or ethnic identity, sexual identity, I think, let me know what y'all think here in a moment, um, is something we have to survive based on the trauma, the systems of oppression that befall us, right? So I remember being in grad school and learning about at-risk communities, right? And there was a lot of communities that I belonged to. But then I was wondering, where is the risk? I don't think the risk is inherently in being a member of this group, the group membership. The risk is how the rest of the world receives or not receives us, right? So when you hear that trans kids are an at-risk group, I don't think it's in them being trans, right? It's in the bullying and the non-belonging and the messages of unworthiness that get downloaded, right? I saw an awesome shirt that said, being Black is lit, but kind of dangerous, right? In certain spaces. And I really liked the humor it was adding to the fact that it's not inherent in our group membership. It's a part of how that group has to navigate the minefield of the world around us. So thank you for that share and illuminating that nuance, right? We have a couple others. Bullying, reporting a crime and being met with restrictions or retaliation. Yes, that's a lot. That's oftentimes, at least in the sexual assault survivor community, why a lot of people don't report, right? This list can go on and on, unfortunately, right? Neglect is up here. Any type of traumatic accident, yes. And so it's actually quite vast, the survivor community. So as we're talking about moving from survivor to thriving, almost all of our clients, almost every human with some years under their belt may be a part of this conversation, right? May have been surviving something and need to learn how to move into thriving, that we'll talk about. Okay, thank you for this rich share here. Let's move back to our PowerPoint. Okay. So we know that we're dealing with survivors, even if they don't identify as a survivor, because it's one of these other, maybe more hidden things that they've survived. So a survivor is a person who has or continue to live his, her, or their, or neither their own life successfully despite experiencing difficulties, right? Surviving is one who continues to live or exist, especially after coming close to some type of devastating or life-threatening event or situation, right? Survivor and surviving. We got these terms under our belt now. And we see the vast amount of people who can fit into those definitions. So here's a little continuum. I love a good continuum. I don't like a binary, right? It doesn't fit for nature, it doesn't fit for us. So here's a continuum I would like to propose to you all, right? And this is a continuum from suffering, surviving, all the way up to liberation. We'll talk all about these stops along the way. And I want to talk about why it's so important to move up the spectrum here. But let's start on the lower end. We have suffering. There are people in our humanity community who are suffering today. We saw a lot of the conditions of suffering on our last share: homelessness, refugee communities, right? So suffering is that active experience of pain, right? While surviving is, moving through that with maybe intermittent cessations of suffering. Then we have coping, resistance, thriving, and liberation. Let's talk about these. Okay. So something I say is that when we're faced with chronic inhumanity or injustice, uncertainty, and hardship, depending on our access, our resources, and our placement in time and history, we'll respond somewhere on this spectrum, right? The goal is to keep moving and pushing to liberation for all of us, okay? So, a couple of things in the chat as well. So mental illness is something we survive. Police violence, we're all surviving that, especially Black and Brown communities. And in addition, severe mental illness. Okay, thank you for the share, Susan. Especially that intersection between mental illness and religious persecution and bullying because of that religious identity. Thank you. Keep the shares coming. There's so much more to capture. So let's talk a little bit about suffering because we know what's happening as we speak. So it's the state of undergoing pain and distress, of hardship, right? It's that active distress. The focus here is on remaining alive under active pain and suffering. There's no time or room for aspirational wants, growth, or capacity. And oftentimes we can dissociate because of the suffering we're under, right? A lot of times, at least in psychological theory, we think dissociation is a protective faculty to get some type of cessation from the pain, right? Then let's look at surviving, okay? The goal is still to remain alive under constant threat, right? We talked about maybe brief cessations of that active suffering period. The focus also is on attending to basic needs, right? Temperature, water, shelter, right? Making ends meet when you're in suffering. It's a constant grind of just trying to survive. The focus is hourly, and again, no time for aspirational growth or want, right? And there's a fast pace to life. Oftentimes when we're surviving, we're in that midbrain area, and it can feel very frantic and disjointed, right? And you'll see that as we're looking at each of these domains, we're looking at what's the focus, how does life feel, and is there room for growth and aspirational goals, and what's the pace to life? So as we move out of surviving to coping, so we're not drowning, that would be suffering. Surviving might be keeping your head above water. Coping in this swimming analogy is maybe treading water, or maybe you have a little bit of a flotation device that might not last very long, right? So under coping, the focus is still responding to constant stressors, but maybe not constant threats to life and limb, right? But you've still got quite a few seismic stressors. The energies now are put forth to tolerating, are minimizing, managing that stress, but you're definitely not out of that stressful situation. Maybe some basic needs are covered, right? So if you have cooling system in this heat wave, maybe you're coping rather than surviving or in suffering. And any free time is used for resting and getting ready for the next response rather than something aspirational, but also not in the direct suffering, right? And there's a little bit more, less frantic pace to life under coping. Next is a stage that we often don't talk about. We talk about surviving, we talk about coping, but I also wanted to talk about resisting, right? Many of the communities that we're identifying that are marginalized and subjugated and oppressed go through a resisting stage as well, right? So then this resisting stage, in my view, the focus is on rejecting and unsubscribing, divesting from harmful narratives, harmful programming, harmful spaces, all the harm-inducing spaces, right? So there's some avoidance, right, of those spaces. We're rejecting some of those spaces. Sometimes basic and psychological needs are getting secured, or we're trying to participate in systems that can give us those basic needs getting secured. And this is the place where we're going counterculture, right? We're swimming upstream. That's the resistance here, where we're divesting from mainstream ideas and ideologies that no longer serve us, right? So we're in active resistance. Sometimes this can be a slower pace of life as we've kind of hopped off the hamster wheel that was harming us. Yet it still takes constant energies to remain in this type of resistance. Going upstream is very weathering. You're going against the grain. The current is pushing against you. So that still requires quite a bit of energies, emotional labor, and cognitive taxing, right? It's hard to maintain this lifestyle. Okay? So you can think of friends amongst you yourself, who take different routes because you don't want to be stopped, right? There's some places in certain states where people of color know not to stop, right? You just hold your pee and take the water with you until you get out of that space, right? That would be a resistance strategy, right? There are certain times people of sexual minorities don't hold hands with their partners, right? Certain spaces where they know that wouldn't be safe. That's resisting, right? Or there's certain brands and places you don't shop anymore because you know that money isn't going to causes that edify your group, right? And so all this energy is resisting, right? And for good measure. Let's talk now about thriving and liberation, and we'll talk more about these two because this is where we want to head. So coping, flotation of ice, resisting, swimming upstream. What's thriving? Thriving now is where your focus gets to shift from maintenance to addition, to development. We'll talk about flourishing, right? You're no longer just trying to germinate, you're actually trying to grow and spread and actually have maybe some abundance. So your basic physical and psychological needs are firmly secured. Maybe they're not a day-to-day, hourly worry anymore. There's some emerging capacity for aspirational desires, right? You may have heard in the earlier categories people saying, ain't no time for that, right? For hobbies and all these other expanding things. But here, maybe there's time now for aspirational desires, whatever they may be. There might be room for emotional contentment, and there's a slower pace of life, right? Okay. I want us to pause here and think about our own family, right? What was the pace for your grandparents? What was the pace for your parents? What pace do you have? What pace are you wanting to pass down, right? I'll share for myself that for my grandma, who I will see very shortly, I'll be going up to DC for a conference and I'll be staying at my grandma's house. I know for her, growing up in Jamaica, her pace of life was very different. As one of 12 siblings, the oldest female, which meant she was a parent early, living closer to the land than I do now. I mean, she had chickens and all these other things. So her pace was very different than my pace, right? For my mom, who was a nurse in the Air Force, who just retired, slower than my grandma, but also very focused on basic needs and survival. And then here I am, who gets to be self-employed as a psychologist, working from home every day, literally with my kiddo in my lap today. So just looking at my own family and the pace of life and the way we work and the way we had to work, chose to work as three generations of Black women, it's very interesting to look across those three generations. It's something that you can help your clients do and do for yourself as well. Now, let's look here. Let's look towards the horizon because we're not here yet, but this is where we want to head. So, in a liberated world, I'm doing a little futuristic here, right? In a liberated world, I would imagine that there are no issues to focus on. Remember that slide I showed you of BEAM? One of the focuses of BEAM is to remove all barriers to Black flourishing, right? To marginalized people flourishing and being well. So in a liberated world, hopefully there wouldn't be those systems of oppression and there wouldn't be real barriers to those basic needs being met, right? So basic physical and psychological needs are secured for you and intergenerational, right? Down the line, you're not having to worry as well. There's capacity for building and empowerment of others because our liberation is bound up, much like our oppression is. And then there's room and time for clarity and self-fulfillment, right? To be self and community identified and defined, right? And because of all those barriers not being there, there'd be time to savor life, right? Maybe not so much of a grind and hustle culture and making wealth for a few. Maybe there would be enough wealth and well-being for us all to slow down and enjoy each other and look around this place, right? So a little bit of a futuristic imagining here, but maybe that's what we are trying to march towards. Let's spend the rest of our time looking at the lower levels that we're actually in and how to push forward. But what types of hardships? Oh, we asked that question already. My second Mentimeter question, I want it to be, where is it? It is, what stage are you all in? Or what stage is your client in? So if you feel transparent enough to share what stage you think yourself is in, go ahead and put I'm in blank. But if you want to share more from what stage most of your clients are in, what you're holding and witnessing in your work, you can share that as well. So using that same link that I'll drop again in the chat for ease, what stage do we think our clients are in? What stage do we see ourselves in? Let's have some discussion around this in our engagement here. What stage is most of your clients in? This is the multiple choice. And you can sound off here in the chat. Okay, right out the gate, we got some resistance, we got coping. We have, let's see, about 20 people in the room. I'll let the voting go until we have at least half, about 10, hopefully 15 people can sound off and vote for us so we can kind of see where the majority of us are at. Right now, with 7 votes in, suffering is leading the way. I'm not surprised given just how trying it is in the world right now. We have a vote in the chat too coming in with 3. I think 3 might be coping. Not much thriving in the room yet. Let's watch this as it changes. Stage is most of your clients in. Let's see if we can get to about 10 or 15 votes. Thank you, Susan. I see that Susan, for herself, is in the thriving stage. So she has time for activism. Yes. Randy, happy to see you're in the thriving stage as well, at least as we're holding this typology today. Let's get a few more votes in, see if it changes things. We're at 9 so far. Most of our clients is in the surviving. Mhm. Any other votes rolling in? Okay. I will circle back to this slide as we press on. So, most of our folks that we're seeing and witnessing and journeying with in counseling are in the surviving stage, squarely in the surviving stage. This makes a lot of good sense, right? Most of the people that might be in suffering might not be accessing our services yet. And so, surviving is what we're seeing a lot. Okay, Isabella's surviving as well, working towards that activism resisting stage. So the stage you are in will greatly impact what you think is possible, right? For the folks in suffering, they might not see the rest of the stages, right? Right around coping and resistance, that middle, you might be able to start to dream for the future, right? And that is really important to know. The stage you're in will dictate, might impact what you think is possible to moving forward. So those of us, a lot of us with the surviving clients, we might need to be that beacon of hope to let them know that beyond coping and resistance, there's thriving and that we're all trying to mush to liberation. And those of us with clients that are in suffering, we want to get them to coping, right? We want to get them marching down this spectrum. So let's talk about some of the skills that help people move up a notch, up a stage. So, especially in the work environment, this is what it can look like, right? I always tell people to reread your job description. Sometimes it's been a while since you maybe seen what you've signed up for, but advocacy starts with knowing what's in and outside of your locus of control and what you ought to be doing. So, in a work capacity, rereading that job description, because slowly over time, sometimes it's sudden in a toxic environment, you're doing more than you signed up for. So being able to start to draw in some guardrails and some boundaries would be nice. Okay? And at least with the clients I work with over here in Silicon Valley, I like to help them neutralize the threat, right? Oftentimes, imposter syndrome, stereotype threat. I work with a lot of Black women in tech, just being the one and the only and the few. Um, exacerbates their feeling to overcompensate or to prove their worth at work. So I like to help them lower the stakes, neutralize the threat, push back on some of that stereotype threat, and know that they're doing a phenomenal job. Oftentimes people come in at 110 and have a hard time scaling back. And so they easily and quickly burn out. Right? And then there's some tools that help us with procrastination, like chunking and making distal goals. So things don't seem so intense right now. These can help us survive a toxic workplace. Then coping, we like to bring your strengths into each task, right? A lot of us are grinding ourselves to a nub, but when you bring your strengths in, it makes the work a little bit more enjoyable, right? How can I make this task that I have to do play to my strengths, play to my superpowers, so I can make it a little bit easier for myself? And then lastly, because we don't do anything well alone, how can I build my work family? Now, sometimes that is a term used against us, work family, because you do anything for your family, right? So sometimes work family is used to push fast boundaries, but who at work can you lean on? Who at work can be a little bit of a tribe? So you can vent, commiserate, and draw strength from their strengths as well. Mhm. And then for resisting, you have limited energies. So, how do you choose your battles at work? What advocacy do you need on your behalf? And you can follow. You don't always have to lead, right? Oftentimes, when we're in the resisting stage, we have to hone and preserve our energies for different fights ahead. So, this is under work. But we can think about surviving, coping, and resisting in other domains of our life, right? Where do we get the replenishment? Who do we need to help hold our head above water? And what systems or dynamics do we need to pull out of so we can kind of preserve our energies? It's the things we want to help our clients start to think about. Sometimes it's nice to draw this spectrum for them and help them plot in their own surviving, coping, and resistance strategies. It's also nice to think about how have people that come before you in your family survived, coped, and resisted. Can you apply any of those skills today? Any of those ancestral learnings? Mhm. So, moving forward, getting people to start to envision what flourishing is, we need to have an idea of what that is as well. So there is the heady kind of jargon definition of flourishing that we'll look at together here. But I love the word flourishing because I think it's an automatopoeia, which is a word that sounds like it is. When you say flourishing, something about the F and the L makes you think of a very lush plant, right? So it's growing beyond its bounds. Maybe it's outgrowing the pot that it's in. It's vivacious, it's unrestricted, it's flourishing, right? So if flourishing in the term refers to both subjective and objective success or growth. And I like the subjective better because you could be flourishing in a way that doesn't really matter to other people, but that's still success. Success usually has a very narrow definition of maybe house, cars, salary. But a lot of people I know out here are flourishing in that way and not flourishing in the ways that matter to them. So it's that subjective feeling of well being, of functioning across multiple domains, right? So not just work, but also family, social, physical, cognitive. It goes beyond any single point, and it's kind of the holistic relationship that you have with yourself and your environment around you. Okay. And the research on flourishing is finally growing. Psychology isn't just looking at pathology, it's looking at positive psych, right? What are the happy people doing? What are the content people doing? What are the people that feel like they're winning at life? What are they doing to thrive, right? So there's individual and communal aspects of flourishing. There's access to certain resources we need for flourishing, right? We don't want to tell people, you go be more resilient. Resilience is about replenishment, recovery, and how we do that in community, right? So think of it as whole person thriving, right? It's complex, there's a lot of nuance, but this person has all the nutrients that they need to germinate, to flourish, right? To grow. Okay. A couple resources are a good reference here for you to look further into it. But we're going to look at the PERMA model of flourishing as well. So the quick definition would be it is a condition that denotes good mental, physical health, the state of being free from illness, because well being is not just the absence of illness, it's the presence of positive attributes. And it's being filled with vitality, functioning in one's social and personal life. The opposite of flourishing is languishing, probably another automatopoeia, but languishing is that stagnant state of non-growth, right? So what matters to us in this concept is what are we going to share with the client? We don't want to bombard them with definition, but as professionals, definitions help. But here's something we could actually show a client, help engage with them, break out different pieces, and actually begin to map out what fits under these areas for them, right? So positive emotion is one, right? How am I going to feel good more often? It's really under positive emotion. Am I doing more of the things that I enjoy? How do I move from that surviving, which there isn't much time for what we enjoy, to coping, resistance, and flourishing, where there is some downtime to engage with things that we enjoy, right? Positive emotions also about emotional regulation. How do I manage the negativity that is in the air, that is in the climate, and how do I notice that, but focus on the rainbows, things that give me replenishment, right, amongst the clouds? So how do I regulate negative emotion? How do I shift that mindset towards resilience, right? And in doing so, build some neuroplasticity. So helping people feel more positive emotion, engaging with things that will regulate, but also bring flow and savoring. Savoring might be one of my favorite techniques to teach people about because it's that slowing down and actually juicing every drop out of the rind, out of life, right? If something's good is happening, how do I savor that and pull back on it in moments of hardship, right? So, positive emotion, engagement, obviously relationships. How do I transform challenging dynamics in relationships if I have that bandwidth and lean into the positive relationships that replenish me? I remember my therapist telling me, because therapists ought to have therapists, to find more people that can celebrate with me and not just people I'm caretaking for, right? So looking for that positive resonance in that community, right? Being poured into as much as you pour out. That's something for us in here as well. And then meaning. These last three, meaning, achievement, and vitality, are usually ones we forget. We think about positive emotion, engagement, and relationship. Let's take a moment on meaning. Meaning is different for us all. We might find meaning in different spaces and places. For a lot of us, it's our spirituality or faith, and that is a spectrum as well, right? Be it organized religion or be it nature, be it some type of connected to something larger than yourself. It can fit under this umbrella of meaning making, right? Purpose, passion, service, giving back. Um, this is where, in that identity, that survivor identity, finding meaning from what happened, but also meaning beyond what's happened, is a huge healing part in moving from surviving to thriving. Okay. What can I take from this, right? How do I move past this in terms of my identity? Huge part of existential meaning making. And then there's achievement, okay? But not in the ways that I'm steeped in out here at Stanford, right? With all the badges and accolades and clout. No shade to those types of achievement, but maybe a little shade, because we can get over caught up in those types of achievement and then find ourselves on what's called the hedonic treadmill, where we're always seeking the next badge or the next shiny thing to validate ourselves. I call that empty validation calories. They're kind of like Cheetos, right? You feel full, but they're not nutrient, right? So achievement in this PERMA model might not be the things that we put on our resume, our LinkedIn, but they're the things that, related to engagement across this model, are the things that fill us up on the inside, that we have intrinsic motivation to do. So achievement here might be, beating your record for how many times you can jump rope without messing up, right? No one's going to know about that. It's not going to get you a pay raise, but it's something maybe you want personally, right? Achievement here might also be, making your kid's Halloween outfit, right? And making it really well because you wanted to get into sewing, right? So it's these unsung, hidden things that you complete, right? Now, achievement is tied to one of our human core basic needs of competency and mastery. We want to feel competent in our world, and we want to feel good at the things that matter to us, right? So it's goal setting, it's achieving that goal, however small or large, however visible or invisible, right? And it's persevering to that goal. It's who we become along the way. Oftentimes, the celebration isn't so much in acquiring the thing, it's in getting to there, right? It's the journey, not the destination, right? So these are the types of achievement that we want to highlight in our lives, in our clients' lives. These are the things that will give that personal fulfillment, okay? Okay, and then vitality. What's this? This is the one that gets very little time and airtime. But this is the experience of being in your physical body, right? How do we make the temple we inhabit a good place to be, both mentally with how we think and feel about ourselves, but also physically, wherever we are in the able-bodied spectrum, right? Some of us have more or less able-bodiedness. That's changing for all of us over time. But this is about balance, alignment, sleep, nutrition, physical activity in all the ways that we define it. It doesn't have to be lifting weights, doesn't have to be running a marathon, but how do you inhabit your body in a way that feels good? right? How do we down regulate stress physically in our body, not just mentally, right? How do we induce states of calm, right? So for me, vitality looks like dance, looks like Zumba, looks like breath work and meditation. It looks like checking every so often during the day to make sure my shoulders aren't up. I walk around very braced. I don't know why, maybe intergenerational trauma, but my muscles are always braced, right? And so learning how to have a relaxed posture, learning how to manage my energy and have a good energy budget for all the things I want to get done, right? So lots of good bullet points on this slide to walk yourself and clients through. But PERMA is the leading model for how to think about flourishing and well being and how to get intentional on meeting some of these states and uh, goalposts in terms of well being. So let's talk about it, right? A model is a model, but what is like the lived experience? I like to say the boots on the ground where the rubber meets the road. Having gone through this PERMA model, and I'll leave it up, what do you think is the hardest part for your clients to engage in? Is it the positive emotion? Is it engagement, relationships, meaning, vitality? What might be hardest for our clients to really get on board with? Right? And we will look at our answers together. Take a good mental shot of this as I bring us to our vote. What might be the hardest part for our clients to get on board with? This is not multiple choice. This you get to free respond in the chat or here. Relationships. Mhm. Depending on what they're surviving, relationships would be a hard one. Can I trust again? Do I trust myself in relationship? Do I trust my judgment? Depending on the type of trauma we're enduring or surviving from, that can be a hard one. Mhm. But it's the one we need the most, probably, relationships. Mhm. Positive emotion. Let's take a moment here on positive emotion. Um, Being someone who works a lot with depression and treatment resistant depression, being someone who grew up with a depressed older sibling, positive emotion can be a hard one to kind of sell or invite a client to engage in. Sometimes, given the types of depression that people have, it being depressed can almost become a part of someone's identity. I am the depressed person. I have this outlook on the world. It can be hard to give up, right? There can be grief and mourning in becoming healthy, right? Because it's not who you once was. Yeah. Vitality is a hard one to maintain. Optimism in general, positive emotions, self-love. Mhm. Now, if you know a little bit about me and my mission, self-love is a big one. Big, big, big one. I think everything changes when we begin to walk in our worth as people, our inherent worth. And so that's a hard one to swim upstream with all the messages of lack and non-enoughness that we get on a daily basis. Right? Here's another share. Finding a reason to get up in the morning, finding their purpose in life. Mhm. Yes. There's a couple great TED Talks about purpose and how for multi-passionate people, it might not just be one thing. And that how purpose has even sometimes been packaged or co-opted by capitalism to mean find the thing that makes money, when really sometimes our purpose might not be what makes us, what gives us financial security, right? Do any of you know what Vera Wang was before a dress designer? She was an engineer. Yes, an editor. She was actually an engineer, I think mechanical engineer. Some of us might agree or identify with the immigrant experience of, if you're first generation and your parents are immigrants, they probably want you to have a vocation that makes a lot of money or has security. And this is also Vera Wang's story. She went to school, got her engineering degree, gave it to her parents, and then went off to design school, right? She wanted to do her due diligence of following what her parents wanted for her, but it's not what her heart wanted, right? Can you imagine telling immigrant parents that you want to draw dresses for a living, right? Or dance or what have you? And so in the interlocking oppressive systems that befall us sometimes. I'm always talking about white supremacy, capitalism, and patriarchy. But oftentimes in interlocking oppressive systems, we find ourselves making decisions that are based on survival, right? When I work with my first generation low income students, I talk to them about purpose, passion, and paycheck, the 3 Ps, and how hard it is sometimes to pursue purpose and passion when you need to secure the paycheck, and how you can be graceful and loving to yourself if you pursue that paycheck P first versus the other ones. So getting a little off here, but sometimes our purpose in life is what keeps the lights on. And it can be hard to get up in the morning when you're not aligned with that purpose, right? So it can be very hard. Relationships, vitality, self-awareness, even peer pressure, right? Being self-aware enough to know what are my values versus all the noise from everyone else, right? So we're holding that moving to flourishing is a arduous process, but we're always letting our clients know that they're worth the fight. They're worth the hardship of getting there, right? Mm-hmm. So PERMA is not easy. Okay, I agree. Let's talk a little bit more now about how to kind of help usher a client up this spectrum, right? How to keep moving in the desired direction and why. So here, when you have these slides, here's the explanation of the PERMA acronym. I also want to talk now a little bit about what is thriving for the Black community. This is what BEAM focuses on. This is one of my multiple focuses, particularly to center and uplift a community. And the funny thing here is a lot of the things that are thriving for the Black community is thriving for other communities. And when one community thrives, I often think it becomes a ripple effect, right? Because our liberation is bound up. Okay. So thriving for the Black community is ubiquitous because we're not a monolith. There's a lot of different shades and lived experiences within the Black community. But first off, a lot of times it's about removing barriers to wellness, removing barriers to access that have been historically and present tense there, and removing barriers to authenticity, right? Here is a very great book called Thriving While Black, The Act of Surviving and Thriving in the Same Space. It's about Black folks thriving in corporate spaces, right? Where usually there's a lack of representation and lack of access. So for me, I like to think of this process: resisting, reclaiming, reconnection, rewriting the narrative, healing, affirming, sharing, and then sharing those knowledges. So Black thriving requires usually resisting narratives that don't serve us, systems that don't serve us. So we talked about what resistance looks like. Reclaiming is an interesting process. Reclaiming essentially is, how do I identify and re-own, kind of snatch back, grab back the parts of myself that I had to let go of, for example, in acculturation or in code switching. How do I reclaim those parts of myself, right? How do I reconnect with those? A lot of my clients will talk about how assimilating into a system is a type of violence. They have to negotiate on what parts of themselves or what parts of their authenticity they'll let go of. And there's synonyms or synonymous feelings across communities, right? Cultures and groups that have let go of their language in certain spaces or don't teach their children the language. Parts, even when we can pass or not pass, deciding when to come out where. What parts of ourselves do we think we can take with us and into what spaces? So reclaiming is usually discerning, usually around safety. What parts am I not going to let go of anymore? What parts of myself am I going to keep close to me regardless of the space? Right? Reconnecting with that usually looks like reconnecting with a larger community, right? Finding your people wherever they are, virtually or in person, and seeing just how many different ways that identity can manifest. I'd love to say there's more diversity within groups than between groups, right? And so reconnection usually looks like community, becoming a part of a larger community and finding that belonging, right? And then being affirmed for the ways that you show up. And then rewriting the narrative. This is a cognitive process. Anyone familiar with CPT, of course, CBT, we're looking at what meaning am I going to make? What story am I going to author about what's happened to me? What I think is possible to happen to me? A lot of times, those of us in oppressive systems have what's called a shortened future, or don't really envision the way forward for ourselves, or even preclude ourselves from certain opportunities because we just don't think it's for us because of the narrative of oppression that has given us. Oh, we don't do that, or we can't do that, or I could never do that, right? And so rewriting that narrative once you've reclaimed what's yours and reconnected to the people that can affirm you. Okay? And then from that affirmed place, sharing that, right? There's nothing better than being a trailblazer who becomes a torchlighter, right? It's hard to be a trailblazer. It's fraught with a lot of anxiety, but trailblazers often become torchlighters, meaning they can affirm, uplift, and make the road a little bit smoother for those behind them, right? And many communities do this, but particularly the Black community has had a lot of practice in doing this as well. Okay. One thing I will say before pressing on, talking about barriers here, is the emotional barrier from being a survivor to thriving. Oftentimes, people who have survived something um, feel like surviving is the stage they have to stay in because it's familiar, it's working to some degrees, and they don't know what's on the other side of surviving. And some of the behaviors they've picked up on to survive keep them safe. And it's very hard to try to mess with someone's sense of safety. But what I like to say, and what many of us know in the room, is that oftentimes the shields that we've developed to be safe can become fences that end up boxing us in, right? Let's take an example. Let's say I saw in our Mentimeter share that relationships is hard, part of the PERMA model for someone. Let's say you've been let down or betrayed. Let's say you're a survivor of intimate partner violence. And part of the way you've survived is to not trust other people and you become hyper independent. Well, that shield is now a fence in terms of not being able to commune with others, to be vulnerable with others, to be your full authentic self, or even to have intimacy, emotional and otherwise, with people because of that fear of being harmed again, right? So when a shield becomes a fence, that survivor skill that was adaptive, maybe in one context, has overstayed its welcome or maybe has been over applied and now is a hindrance rather than a help. And helping clients see that diminishing return of a survivor skill can be helpful in helping them shift from surviving into thriving, right? But we also want to help them identify what their barriers are. Is it an over applied survivor skill, or is it these things that actually exist in the real world? So some barriers for the Black community specifically are some that I want to share with you here. They all fit under this umbrella of anti-Blackness, right? Some of us might be familiar with this term, some of us might not be. So as introduction or review, anti-Blackness is behaviors and policies that are rooted in the history and the present tense application of that history of colonialism that um, that make the Black experience, the Black membership, a a minoritized experience, right? Where we're precluded from certain accesses and treated differently, right? It's global, it's tied to colonialism and racism, and shows up across institutions, legal institutions, medical institutions, any of the pillars of our society, right? So anti-Blackness is any behavior, bias, or policy that precludes the access and full flourishing and well-being of Black people. And like a lot of forms of oppression, it has many manifestations, right? It is in the beauty industry and the marketing industry. So worldwide, there is a very lively market for bleaching, right? The lighter you are, the closer to whiteness, often the more deemed in the Eurocentric beauty standard, the better, right? This is coming straight out of slavery, in which lighter skinned folks were given more privileges and less harsh treatment, right? So that's a type of anti-Blackness, right? Where darker skinned people are treated more poorly, right? We also see it in romance, in relationships, where there's preferences based on that skin tone. Um, I don't know if any of you are aware, but there is a lot of prejudice that happens on dating apps, usually for Black women and Asian men. Someone created an app for Black women and Asian men to meet up as the two most groups that have less traction on dating apps. So if you're working with a young person of those two ethnicities, that might be part of their experience, right? Lack of leadership, lack of upward mobility in businesses can be a manifestation of anti-Blackness, as there's only, 14 Black CEOs when this study was done. Of course, derogatory remarks, lack of access, poor maternal health rates, all of these things that we've seen and heard about in our communities, in our clients' lives, are manifestations of anti-Blackness. And again, we're talking about it here because when you're talking to your Black clients about flourishing, and there is this global Black backdrop of anti-Blackness, it needs to be addressed. And we can and ought to talk about the hopelessness that can come up about how am I going to flourish when I'm up against these types of systemic barriers? It's a real question, one that needs to be addressed with care, one that needs to be addressed with authenticity of, yeah, these things still exist, but how can we, Michelle Obama talks about, attend to our knitting. Anyone who's read The Light We Carry knows that she talks about locus of control is what we would call it in our discipline. But she talked about during the pandemic how she would just knit. That was something she could control literally in her lap, in her own hands. So even against this backdrop that we're still chipping away at daily, how can I seek that mastery, that autonomy, that agency, and that well-being in the locus of control, in the spheres that I operate? That's still a worthy cause to rise to against the backdrop of all that we're dealing with in this current climate, right? So we can hold both at the same time. It's a very powerful clinical skill to hold the reality of things and still inspire hope. We don't have to be in either or. We can really stretch that shade of gray and exist within that. Mm-hmm. So here's a hard one that I get a lot. So why don't we just tackle it together? How would you address the impact of anti-Blackness with your clients? I gave a couple thoughts. How have you? And how would you if it hasn't come up for you yet? Okay. What are some of your best practices? What stance do you hold? We could also use this time for holding some of the challenges. Let's say you're not a Black clinician. Let's say you are a Black clinician and Um, you are having some of those hopeless feelings yourself. I've been there mid-pandemic where I had to take a little time off because the vicarious trauma was getting too much. How would you address it? What are your fears, hopes, best practices? Let's sound off here together and hold this. Mhm. It's gonna come up. So when it does, let's be ready. See what I have in the chat. Thank you for putting the link back in there, Jeremy, for easy access. This could also be a space to, now that we have maybe a wider understanding of what anti-Blackness is and how it shows up, what have you seen? What are you seeing in your practice? Mhm. Recognition, first and foremost. Yes. Recognition is a slept on skill. So much of our Black clients' life is when they're out in the world is people maybe denying their experience, minimizing their experience and saying, oh, don't make it about that again, or that's not what's happening here. Ibram Kendi, our leading anti-racist scholar, says that the heartbeat of racism is denial. So our clients are met with a lot of denial in the spaces they exist in. So for your therapy room, your practice to be the first place to recognize it and to call a spade and to say, yes, that's happening or that is what it is. Recognition can be a very soothing salve on a very irritated experience, right? Acknowledging their Blackness in a positive way and engage in their identity. Yes. There are so many ways to do this. And for those of us who are not Black, it can be interesting and hard to step into, but I encourage you to do it anyway. Let me share two fun stories about how this has been done with me in the past as just anecdote and normalization, right? Of what this can look like in our first forays of doing so. Better to do it and try than to not to. So, one experience I had with not a therapist, but a professor in my graduate school, as he was attempting to acknowledge my Blackness and bring that identity forth. He basically said, so I noticed you're Black. How's that? And me being who I am, I loved it and rolled with it. And it was better than not acknowledging it, right? He's like, so how's being Black going, right? And since I was the only Black student in my graduate program, it was something in my experience. So we talked about it, and it was an open invitation, however clunky, that I was able to talk to him about that moving forward, my experience in graduate school. The other experience I had that was a little less funny was I did have a therapist who, this was an undergrad, who kept bringing everything back to my Blackness, even when it wasn't related. So that was a little harder. And so for that experience, I eventually told him, you know what, I'll let you know when I feel like these two things are related, right? So go for it and experience the discomfort. Share some of that discomfort if it is discomforting for you. And I actually have a colleague, a white person, who they said that in their informed consent as a white person, they say the following. They're going through all the other pieces of the informed consent, and they also say, as a white person, I've been, privy to a certain type of socialization. So I am likely to make a rupture in here in our work. And when I do, I want us to take these steps. If I say something that's stereotypical to your Black experience or your Latinx experience or your this experience, fill in the blank of their identity, I would like for us to bring that up in a way that feels comfortable to you, especially if I don't know it. So they do some microaggressive priming, so when this happens in our work, these are the steps we can take. And I like the onus that brings into the room, and the intimacy that it primes for. Mhm. And our last share here so far is understanding the inherent trauma of being Black in the US, right? And remembering it when approaching their trauma and using trauma informed care. Yes, 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 yes. I want to throw up the clap hands emoji for this one. The inherent trauma, right? So it's not if it's there, it's how is it showing up today? And then remembering that a lot of things can be triggering, a lot of things can activate intergenerational or vicarious trauma for people, and then proceeding with all the benefits and interventions of trauma for informed care, consent, letting people know what the process is so they can participate to the degrees they want, sharing the power, all those things for folks that have um, inherent trauma baked into their experience. You all are on a good track here. Let's talk about a few more things and we will have some Q&A time. So, many different ways to address the impact of anti-Blackness. Being able to use that term is very edifying as well. And they're like, "Oh, you're on the up and up. You know that this thing exists in the zeitgeist." So I encourage you to do so and bring that forth, that identity forth. Okay. So now I would like to stop share screen and just have some time. Usually we only have an hour. I'm feeling luxurious with our time today. So let's take a purposeful pause, see how our bodies are doing. I like to say, see what's resonating, which means what are you vibing with? What feels right in line? But also check in to see what you might be resisting. What feels tense about what we shared today? What feels maybe like you might be pushing back? All your sensations are data points to you and are valid. So, what questions might we have? What deeper dives do we want to take into some of these areas that we overviewed? It's always nice to actually be in conversational community together. So, take a moment. No need to rush. What might be coming up as a reflection, an anecdote, and or a question?
It looks like we had one question come up in the chat from Kimberly.
Let's see. Can you read it for me?
Yes, it's
Yeah.
difficulty recognizing that I'm in surviving when that is so far away from thriving.
Ah, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. When it's kind of mapped out as a spectrum, we can see what stages we're not in, and that can bring up some difficult feelings, right? Mhm. And I think any of those stages that I kind of discreetly made has an arc of its own, right? And any stage model you can kind of ebb and flow in different points and periods and points of time in your life, right? So it can be difficult to be maybe identified in one stage when you want to be in another, or maybe thought you were in another. But there's always grace in the growing and working through that difficulty, right? Through conversation, through deeper study or identification of this. And it could also be possible we can be on one stage in one domain and another stage in another. So it's very nuanced and not black or white. And so maybe surviving emotionally, but could be thriving financially or in another way, physically, right? And so giving ourselves that grace to be in more than one space at one time. Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, it does give us something to strive for, right? That wherever we are is not where we need to remain if we don't want to, right? If there's still more advantageous places to go, right? And that there's more room. And what I like to say is, my ancestors passed down survival skills because that was the focus of that generation. What do I want to pass down when I'm an ancestor, right? Whether you have kids of your own or not, one day we will be the ancestors, right? And so I'm trying to focus on passing down intergenerational health, not just legacy or surviving skills and grind skills. I want to pass down some ease skills, right? I want to pass down uh, some rest and replenishment and not just being strong and making a way out of no way. One thing, fortunately and unfortunately, that my mothers taught me is there's this phrase that they would say of turn your own key, which meant be self-reliant. Like don't really depend on anybody too much. And I know that's coming from their trauma narrative. And it did benefit them that they could turn their own key, meaning, be self-sufficient. And I want to be able to lean when I need to. And I want to be able to rest in the safety of others. So how do I pass on that ability to trust and that ability to be taken care of, right? Mhm. But yeah, parenthood really makes you focus on trying not to continue down to pass down trauma. This is so true. As a therapist for young adults, I'm always wondering, what is my kiddos going to be telling their therapist, right? I don't think any of us make it out of childhood without some luggage, but hopefully mine just have little carry-on, something light that they can stow above, nothing too heavy, no overweight charges, hopefully, is what I want to pass down in terms of luggage, baggage. hmm hmm Okay. Let this be just the appetizer. Let this conversation continue, right? Hopefully, I gave you some things that sparked your curiosity for yourself and others. There's no other profession like ours, right? Where we are our best tool, right? So the more well and aware you are, the better your service will be, right? So let this be a conversation starter amongst yourselves, within yourself, and start thinking about PERMA a little bit more. How do I fold in positive psychology, even with people who might be surviving, right? How do I ignite that hope to keep pushing for more ease, more security, and more fulfillment? Mhm. So, if there are not any other questions, I want to thank you for your presence. In an attention economy, presence is a very hot commodity. So, thank you for your time and lending that to me. And I will pass it back to Leah and Jeremy for any closing remarks.
We wanted to just thank everybody for joining today, especially Dr. Megan. It's always so great to hear from you, and you always come with such a great perspective and provide such amazing information. So we want to thank everybody for attending today as well. So once again, thank you, everybody. And if you have questions, just let us know in the follow-up.